starboard wheel is Passenger Escobar. Passenger Escobar. Sincerely right to your special wheel. Would you please identify yourself and to a flight attendant? Passenger Escobar, please.
300.